Alright guys, this is chapter 4 of the Connorland APUSH review for 2013 and 14. In this one we'll be dealing with chapter 9 and chapter 10. Hopefully, if I have enough time, it'll be the Civil War and Reconstruction. Alright, so we're going to lead off with Northern advantages and disadvantages, but before we even get to that, we've got to figure out why the South seceded from the Union. And there were two different camps in the South at this time. The people that were for secession, they believed that the North had violated their rights with the things that they had done in the acts and the things leading up to this moment. Also, they believed that all the money that they produced, all their economic advantages, were given up to the North. Now, on the flip side of that, you've also got people who are against secession, and these were the people who believed that the people who were yelling about states' rights, they believed that the people who believed that they shouldn't secede believed that the South gave up their rights when they joined the Union. So you couldn't really yell about Southern rights and things when you were a part of America. And also, they believed there was an informal social contract amongst the people to stay a part of the Union. So that's kind of the lead up of why they left. Now, as we move into the war, the advantages for the North and the disadvantages consist of the following. As far as the advantages, number one, they have an infrastructure already in place to be able to fight a war. In other words, they have railroads. They can get stuff from one place to another. They also have a lot of industry comparatively to the South, so they can produce goods for the war, like weapons, like uniforms, like all the things that an army needs to be able to fight a war, and also a population they can draw from for their soldiers. As far as their disadvantages go, really the main one that they have is there's a shortage of capable military commanders at the beginning, and that's mainly because they're concentrated in the South. As far as the advantages and disadvantages from the Southern perspective, number one, they could fight a defensive war. In other words, they didn't have to go in and attack the North or anything like that. They could hunker down and stay at home. Also, they had cotton, which was one of the most valuable economic commodities at this time. And also, like I said in the last one, a lot of the military commanders who were capable and experienced were located in the South. As far as their disadvantages, they had a relatively small population compared to the North, and little industry because, as we've talked about, most of their economy was based on the plantation system with cotton and slavery and things like that. So they didn't really have a need for factories, and because of that, they won't be able to produce as many goods, war goods, as the North. Along with the North and the South, we also have three border states, and they're pretty important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the location. They're kind of, and we're talking about Missouri, uh, I guess Maryland, West Virginia, and Kentucky, and they're a pretty important one because they're a buffer zone between the North and the South and the fighting forces. Also because of the resources that they're able to produce, particularly agricultural products that the North is not able to produce themselves. As far as the battles and things of the Civil War, like most wars that we talk about, you really only have to worry about the turning points or the things where things change. And the big one in the Civil War is Antietam, which is a turning point because what it did, it persuaded England and France to remain neutral and not come in on the part of the South. So it's important for that reason. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation is a turning point during the war as well because it gave the North and Europe to a certain extent a moral cause for the war. Obviously, Lincoln comes out during the Emancipation Proclamation uh, and frees slaves in the South. Now, he doesn't have any legal basis to do it, and the Emancipation Proclamation actually doesn't free any slaves because it's hard to free slaves in a place that you don't control, which is what the South is at this time. But it really rallies the war effort in the North and gives them a reason to go out and win this thing. Moving on to key political actions during the Civil War, the first of which is the charter of the Union Pacific Company and the Central Pacific Company by the federal government to build a transcontinental rail line, which we'll talk about later. But it's made there simply at first to be able to transport war goods and soldiers and things like that. Next is the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered land to people who would settle the West and move some of our population out there and settle it. And then the suspension of habeas corpus, which is a big time upping of presidential power by Lincoln during the war. Habeas corpus, just as background, what it said is that you had to be brought before a judge or a court to be charged with a crime, and by suspending this, Lincoln is saying you no longer have to do this. All right, so rolling on to Chapter 10 in Reconstruction, obviously we're doing serious disservice to the Civil War here, but for time purposes, we can only concentrate on the main events and really the lead up and the consequences of it, and Reconstruction is the big consequence that comes out of it. And all Reconstruction is how are we going to put this country back together? How are we going to rebuild the South or integrate them back into the Union. First thing you need to know about Reconstruction are the amendments to the Constitution that come out because of it, because of the Civil War and during Reconstruction. And they're the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th provided, well, what the 13th did is it abolished slavery. It got rid of it. The 14th makes slaves citizens, and the 15th gives them the right to vote. So we'll talk about these a little bit more in class, but just, if anything, know the basic components of them and what they did. Now, as far as how to bring the South back into the Union, you have two different philosophies and two different plans. The first is, and it's not on here, and we're going to look at a chart in class comparing these, but presidential Reconstruction, which is the one that is proposed by Lincoln and later carried out by Johnson. On the flip side of it, you have radical Reconstruction, which is done by a group of Republican congressmen known as radical Republicans. Some of the causes of radical Reconstruction: number one is there some Confederate congressmen reelected. Also, black codes are being instituted in the South during this time, which are kind of, in the views of the radicals, leading back towards slavery. And also, there's a lot of racial tension and riots going on. As far as the main program of it, military occupation or military Reconstruction ends up coming out of it. But like I said, we'll deal with it more in depthly in class, but be aware of these basic components. As far as African Americans during Reconstruction, two things you need to be aware of are sharecropping and black codes. Sharecropping is a way to rent land that kept blacks in perpetual debt, and it's close to slavery, I guess you could say, as Southern people could get it. And also black codes, which restricted their freedoms, independent movement, and stuff like that. All right, rolling on to the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. During the election of 1876, you've got Samuel J. Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes running for president. And it all comes down to some disputed votes in some southern states. And what they had to do is come up with a compromise on how to make this work. Tilden had won 184 out of the 185 electoral votes needed for the presidency, but because of these disputed votes, he couldn't go over the top and win it. The three of the states in which the disputed votes were was in the South, Louisiana being one of these. So they meet and they do the Compromise of 1877, and the significance of it is it essentially ends Reconstruction, but the components of it, the Democrats, they agree that Rutherford B. Hayes will take office out of it, and in return, the radical Republicans, agree to withdraw all troops out of the South, which once again effectively ends Reconstruction. They're also going to begin to put some internal improvements into the South, and things like that. The Republicans begin to abandon their commitment to racial equality out of this as well. So just know the basic facts of it and you should be okay. All right, so moving on to Jim Crow laws, which will be dealt with a little bit later, but you need to know what these things come from. Jim Crow laws were nothing more than a way to separate blacks and whites in every aspect of life. I think I've used the phrase in class, from cradle to the grave. Like, hospitals were segregated and graveyards were as well. In every component and everything you did during your life, in the South during this time, blacks and whites would be separate. So the things that lead into it are the 1883 civil rights cases, which lead to the segregation, and in Plessy versus Ferguson, which we talked about earlier in class, leads to the separate but equal standpoint of how this worked. Also, there's a lot of disenfranchisement. What that means is that there were hurdles that blacks had to overcome to be able to vote, in the form of literacy tests and poll taxes were the two main ones. Okay, the last thing we're going to deal with as a part of this is Booker T. Washington, best known for his Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895. He was a big proponent, and we'll compare him to a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois as we go. But Booker T was a fan of gradual integration, I guess you could call it. He said, before we even start going about trying to get political and social equality, we need to get economic equality. So go to work, do what you got to do. These things will come in time, but you've got to be patient and do it little by little. And he, as far as the key positions, he's an advocate of education, particularly vocational education, which is job training, racial solidarity as far as the unity of black people in the South, political agitation he was not for causing problems, getting loud about things, because he believed it wouldn't help the end cause. And also he was for, like I said, economic self-sufficiency as a means to get political and social equality. So that wraps up very, very briefly, less than 10 minutes. Can't believe I got this done. Civil War and Reconstruction. Next, we will move on to industrialization and other components.